I never thought a Monday could feel so heavy. I woke up like any other day, made my coffee, checked emails, and tried to ignore the subtle tension that had been creeping into the office over the past few weeks. My boss, Daniel, had always been charming, but lately, there was a different edge in his tone, a quiet control that I had shrugged off at first. Sometimes, in business, people act oddly when under pressure, I told myself. But there was something about the way he had looked at me on Friday. That smirk, half pity, half warning, that stuck in my mind. I drove to work in silence, the city's morning rush barely registering. I had always loved my job, finance, investing, managing portfolios. But that day, a small, nagging worry lingered, as if the universe itself was whispering that nothing would feel normal again. It started with the call. HR, my heart sank as I answered. "Mr. Collins," the woman on the other end said, her voice clipped, professional. "We need you to come to the office immediately. There have been allegations regarding missing funds, and your presence is required for an investigation." At first, I thought it was a joke. Someone must be mistaken. Me? Stealing from the company? I had spent years building my reputation, staying late, double-checking numbers, and maintaining integrity. How could this be real? By the time I reached the office, dread had settled into my chest like a heavy stone. Daniel was waiting for me outside the HR door, his expression unreadable. He smiled, that same charming smile, and I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding," I said, my voice betraying more hope than confidence. Daniel tilted his head, his smile tight, controlled. "Let's just get through this, shall we?" The meeting was brief, sterile, and merciless. HR laid out evidence, documents, numbers, transaction records that made no sense to me. Every time I tried to explain, Daniel's subtle nods, his faint smirks, reminded me that I was not being listened to, that I was already losing. By the end of it, my world felt smaller, colder. I was trapped in a nightmare that had been carefully engineered, and I had no clue how to fight it. I left the office early that day, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know where to go, what to do, or how to make sense of the betrayal that had crept into my life so silently. I needed comfort, clarity, maybe just a familiar face. Home. I had hoped, in the darkest corner of my mind, that at least there, I could feel some semblance of safety. That hope died the moment I unlocked the door. There she was, my wife, Emily. The woman I had promised forever to, smiling in a way I had thought was only reserved for me. And in her arms, the one person I had trusted most in my life, Daniel, my boss, my supposed mentor. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My chest tightened so much that I thought I might collapse. Everything I had believed, every plan for the future, every quiet promise we had whispered in the darkness of our bedroom, felt like it had been erased in a single, cruel instant. I didn't speak at first. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring, my brain trying desperately to reject the scene in front of me. Her laughter, the casual touch of his hand on her shoulder, the way she leaned into him. It was like watching a dagger twist in my chest. When I finally found my voice, it was weak, almost foreign. "Emily, what is this?" She turned, and for a moment I thought she would reach for me, apologize, explain. But there was only a flicker of surprise before her expression hardened. "Oh, you're home early," she said, her tone almost bored, as if she had been expecting me, as if she had rehearsed this reaction. I felt like I had been shoved off a cliff without warning. This can't be real," I whispered. "It is real," she said. "I didn't want you to find out like this, but Daniel understands me in ways you never could. He can give me everything I've wanted. You're—" Her words trailed off, dismissive, almost cruel. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to fight back in any way I could. But I was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the sheer weight of betrayal. My wife, my partner, the person I had trusted more than anyone, had abandoned me at the first glimpse of wealth, luxury, and power. Trips to Paris, designer clothes, expensive dinners. These were enough to shatter our vows, enough to make her forget every promise she had made. I left without another word. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage filled with ghosts of what used to be. For weeks, I lived in a haze. Friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. Work had become a battlefield I could no longer fight. Daniel had poisoned every corner of my professional life. Every attempt to defend myself only made things worse. I had been framed, sabotaged, and silenced. In a world where money and influence decided outcomes, I was powerless. But amidst the despair, a small ember of clarity began to glow. Daniel had underestimated me. He thought that because I was currently powerless, I would stay down. He thought that because I had been betrayed, I would crumble. But he didn't know that I had something he didn't: skill, intelligence, discipline, and a mind that didn't break easily. I began to plan, quietly. Not recklessly, not in anger, but carefully. I reminded myself of every late night I had spent studying markets, analyzing investments, perfecting strategies. I reminded myself that I had talent, real, tangible talent, that no amount of wealth, no network of influence could take from me. I swore to myself then, standing alone in my empty apartment, that one day everything would change. Not with shouting, not with public spectacle, but with precision, with quiet, unstoppable momentum. I would rise again, from scratch if I had to, and when the day came, they would regret every choice, every betrayal, every careless moment they thought would bury me. And so, amidst heartbreak, betrayal, and humiliation, the first spark of a plan was born. It would take years. I would need patience, resilience, and cunning. But I had time, and I had skill. And above all, I had a promise whispered to myself in the silence of my despair. I would make them pay. The days after the betrayal felt like walking through a fog. I had lost everything that defined my life, my wife, my career, my sense of safety, and yet, in the quiet despair, a strange clarity emerged. If I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on anger, on confrontation, or on the law. I had to rely on myself, on my skill, and on patience. I decided to start over. I left the city I had called home, packed what little I could carry, and moved to a place where no one knew me. It was a small apartment in a neighborhood that smelled of hope and struggle, and it became the crucible for my plan. I took a small desk, a laptop, and opened a modest office at home. No frills, no distractions, no one to interfere with the rebuilding of my life. At first, the work was grueling. Every deal felt like an uphill battle. I had some savings, but they wouldn't last forever. The market was unforgiving, and mistakes were costly. I made a few, I won't lie, but each one became a lesson. Slowly, carefully, I started carving out a niche for myself. I offered consulting to small investors, built portfolios, and applied strategies that few dared to try. Each success, no matter how small, was a step toward reclaiming the dignity I had lost. I kept my past a secret. No one knew about my former life, my ruined marriage, or the false allegations that had almost destroyed me. I didn't need pity, sympathy, or help. I only needed time, focus, and the ability to think several steps ahead of everyone else. By the second year, my name started to carry weight. Not publicly, not yet, but within the circle of those who mattered. People sought my advice, trusted my instincts, and relied on my judgment. I began to accumulate wealth quietly, reinvesting every profit into ventures that promised long-term growth rather than quick gains. I was careful, precise, calculated. Every decision I made was a brick in the foundation of a future that Daniel and Emily could not possibly imagine. As I worked, I observed. News about Daniel and his company trickled in through industry reports and gossip I discreetly followed. The man who had destroyed me had become complacent. His arrogance blinded him. He made mistakes, took risks for appearances, and underestimated those around him. The same charm that had once fooled me now seemed to have become a mask for recklessness. I noted everything: the poor investments, the overconfidence, the way he underestimated his employees and partners. Every detail was a potential lever for the day I would rise. In the third year, I began forming the strategy that would eventually become my silent revenge. I started creating offshore entities, small shell companies that could operate without attracting attention. These companies would allow me to acquire assets without revealing my identity. It was a game of patience. patience I had learned to embrace. I wasn't looking for immediate gratification. I was preparing for a long-term victory, one that would be complete, undeniable, and unassailable. During this period, I also focused on my mental strength. Betrayal had left scars deeper than I had expected. Nights were sleepless, and moments of despair would creep in. But I reminded myself constantly that anger is temporary. Strategy is permanent. I studied human behavior, business maneuvers, and the patterns of power. I learned to predict how people would act when cornered, how pride and ego could become their own undoing. Every lesson, every insight, became ammunition for the future. By year 4, my company was no longer modest. It had grown steadily, quietly, almost invisibly to the outside world. I had a small but loyal team, people who shared my vision and my work ethic. The company became profitable, respected, and efficient. It was still small compared to the giants in the industry, but my growth rate was undeniable. Word began to spread in select circles that a new player was emerging. A man with vision, discipline, and an uncanny ability to turn struggling investments into thriving successes. It was also during this time that I finally learned the full extent of Daniel's failings. His company had been bleeding money, mismanaged, and losing credibility. A few of his top clients were leaving, frustrated with his decisions. His arrogance and recklessness were catching up to him, and for the first time, I felt the stirrings of real opportunity. This was the leverage I had been waiting for. I studied the company's financials, its market position, and the network of investors who had once trusted Daniel. Every detail became part of my blueprint. By the 5th year, I was ready. My offshore companies had accumulated enough capital to make a move without revealing my identity. I acquired a majority stake in Daniel's company quietly, purchasing shares and assets through layers of entities designed to conceal my involvement. It was meticulous work, but I had spent 5 years perfecting the patience and precision needed for this moment. I did not rush. I observed Daniel as he continued to operate his company, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. Every misstep he took, every overconfidence, every careless decision became part of my advantage. I was a shadow, unseen, patient, and prepared. And then, the day came when I could start turning the company around. I injected capital, restructured operations, and replaced key personnel. Quietly, efficiently, with no one suspecting the silent hand behind the revival. Slowly, the company began to recover. Profits grew, client trust returned, and my influence over operations became increasingly direct. Through it all, I remained invisible. Daniel still believed he controlled everything. He was arrogant, blind to the silent force that had taken root in the very company he had thought was unassailable. He never suspected me. Not once. And that ignorance made the eventual revelation all the sweeter. Yet even as I planned and executed, I did not allow personal vengeance to cloud my judgment. Every decision was calculated for maximum impact and minimum exposure. I was building a victory that would be undeniable, irreversible, and undeniable not just to Daniel, but to the world. And in the quiet moments, I reflected on Emily. I knew she had enjoyed the luxury, the excitement, and the superficial thrill of wealth and power. But I also knew the nature of such desires. They are fleeting. I kept her fate in the back of my mind, knowing that karma often has a way of reaching those who chase only material gain. By the end of the 5th year, my company was a formidable competitor. The groundwork for my final move was complete. I had rebuilt everything that had been stolen from me, my confidence, my wealth, my influence, and now I was positioned to execute the plan that would make Daniel understand, in the most undeniable way possible, what it meant to underestimate me. I had begun as a man shattered, betrayed, and powerless. Now, I was a strategist, a force to be reckoned with, and a patient architect of justice. The world that had humiliated me had no idea that the person it thought was defeated had been quietly preparing for a reckoning that would be precise, calculated, and unforgettable. And so, with the pieces in place, I waited. Patience had been my ally for 5 long years, and soon it would pay dividends that no money, no influence, and no arrogance could ever erase. Daniel had built his empire on the assumption that power alone protected him. But power without foresight, without strategy, without caution, is fragile. and I intended to show him exactly how fragile it could be. The seeds of revenge were planted, watered with patience, nurtured by skill, and strengthened by time. All that remained was to let them grow to fruition, and to watch, silently, as Daniel's world began to crumble under the weight of a quiet, inevitable justice. The day I had been preparing for quietly, meticulously, for 5 long years finally arrived. Daniel was still unaware of the silent force that had taken root in his company. He went about his routines as usual, boasting to colleagues, signing deals, and relishing the control he thought he had over everyone. But behind the scenes, the landscape of power had already shifted. Through my offshore companies, I had acquired a controlling majority of his shares. The acquisition was invisible to him, executed with precision, layered through entities designed to mask my involvement. To Daniel, nothing had changed. To me, everything had changed. I now had the ability to rebuild, redirect, and reclaim not just my professional life, but the narrative of my past humiliation. I began with a quiet restructuring. Key personnel who had enabled Daniel's reckless decisions were replaced. Inefficient systems were overhauled. Investments were corrected. Clients who had left due to Daniel's mismanagement were brought back under discreet, strategic influence. It was a transformation that appeared organic to outsiders, but every move was controlled, every decision a calculated step in a plan that had been years in the making. I watched Daniel closely during this period, enjoying the subtle irony of his oblivion. He continued to operate as if the company was entirely his, unaware that every step he took was now under my oversight. His arrogance blinded him, just as it had 5 years earlier. Every boast, every careless decision, every indulgent moment in his womanizing lifestyle became a marker of his eventual downfall. And then came the moment of revelation. The board meeting that would become the turning point was presented as routine. Annual reviews, financial updates, future strategies. Daniel entered the room with his usual swagger, confident, dismissive, certain of his control. But when the meeting began, the tone shifted. Reports, financial data, and operational plans were presented in a way that subtly highlighted his failures, discrepancies that no one else had noticed until now. Questions from the board, previously ignored, now exposed gaps in his judgment and reckless management. Daniel's confusion turned to anger as the meeting progressed. He demanded explanations for decisions he had no awareness were being challenged. I remained silent, observing from my position behind the scenes, letting the evidence and results speak for themselves. The board, now fully aware of the changes and my control, supported the strategies I had quietly implemented. Daniel realized too late that the company he had believed was unassailable was no longer under his control. The humiliation was intoxicating. Not because I had orchestrated it in anger, but because it was the natural consequence of his overconfidence, his arrogance, and his underestimation of me. Daniel had built his empire on the assumption that power protected him. He had believed that wealth, influence, and charm were enough to shield him from accountability. But he had forgotten one crucial factor. I had the skill, patience, and resolve to execute a plan he never saw coming. Meanwhile, Emily's fate unfolded predictably. She had expected a life of luxury, stability, and excitement with Daniel. But his charm and resources had limits. Within a year, their relationship had deteriorated. Daniel, as I had quietly anticipated, could not remain faithful or committed. The woman who had abandoned me was left discarded, facing the emptiness of a life built on superficial gains and fleeting indulgences. I never intervened directly. Justice, in this case, was poetic and self-sufficient. She experienced the consequences of her choices without me needing to take action. With Daniel marginalized, his influence diminished, and his confidence shattered, I took the final steps in solidifying my position. My company now oversaw operations seamlessly, with clients trusting the stability, strategy, and vision that Daniel had once promised, but failed to deliver. I emerged from the shadows not as a vengeful figure, but as a capable, strategic leader who had rebuilt everything lost, stronger than before. Sitting in the corner office that had once been Daniel's domain, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. The past 5 years had been a crucible, painful, humbling, and transformative. I had experienced betrayal at its deepest level, witnessed the fragility of trust, and endured the humiliation of being powerless. Yet through patience, intelligence, and relentless focus, I had reclaimed not only my life but my dignity, reputation, and influence. I thought about the lessons learned in those dark months after the betrayal. Anger is fleeting, but strategy endures. Power without foresight is fragile. Humiliation can be temporary if one invests in growth and skill. And patience, silent, deliberate patience, is often the most formidable weapon of all. I also reflected on the moral dimension of what I had achieved. Revenge, in its raw, impulsive form, can destroy as easily as it satisfies. I had chosen a different path, measured, calculated, and almost surgical. Daniel's downfall was inevitable, because it arose from his own misjudgments, magnified and amplified by the strategy I had implemented. The poetic justice was that the universe, aided by my patience and skill, had corrected the imbalance without need for cruelty or spectacle. And Emily, she was a reminder that some lessons come from observing the natural consequences of human desires. She had chosen luxury and excitement over loyalty and love. When the thrill faded, she was left facing the hollowness she had embraced. I felt neither triumph nor malice, only the quiet satisfaction that I had been right to focus on building strength and strategy, rather than chasing immediate retribution. By the end, I had rebuilt everything. My company was thriving, respected, and efficient. Daniel's influence was broken, his reputation tarnished, and his arrogance humbled. I had transformed betrayal into an opportunity for growth, humiliation into a lesson in patience, and powerlessness into a strategic advantage. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself to smile. Not a smile of vengeance, but of accomplishment. I had taken the world that had tried to bury me and reshaped it into something that reflected my skill, patience, and resolve. The man who had thought he could destroy me was now a footnote in the story of my rise. And as the city lights shimmered outside the window, I understood one fundamental truth. Life can betray you, people can abandon you, and power can be fleeting. But skill, patience, and intelligence are timeless. They endure. They grow. And when applied with focus and strategy, they can turn the deepest betrayal into the most satisfying victory.